the best entrepreneurs are able to take a punch, pivot, keep going. They don't take it personally, and they're able to persevere. And I think that's
Excellent.
such a critical part of ultimately reaching your potential.
Welcome back to Stepwise, a series of deep conversations with inspiring leaders about who they are, how they see the world, and their journeys that have influenced their worldviews and values. Today's guest is Jeff Immelt. If ever there's an individual who needs no introduction, this is one of those. For those who may not know, Jeff was the 9th chairman of General Electric and served as its CEO for 16 years. He has been named one of the world's best CEOs 3 times by Barron's. During his tenure as CEO, GE was named America's Most Admired Company by Fortune magazine and one of the most respected companies in polls by Barron's and the Financial Times. He has received 15 honorary degrees and numerous awards for business leadership and chaired the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness under the Obama administration. Jeff has a BA degree in applied math from Dartmouth College and an MBA from Harvard University. Fun fact you may not have known, he's also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Jeff is now a venture partner at New Enterprise Associates, a global venture capital and private equity firm, the author of Hot Seat, a memoir of leadership in times of crisis, which I highly recommend, and a fascinating person to talk to. He's smart, thoughtful, determined, and as a friend of mine describes, grounded. It was a blast for me to chat with Jeff. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Jeff Immelt.
Congrats on the book. That was an MBA in a box. It was captivating. It was so educational. And as a recovering MBA myself, boy, I'll tell you what, there were so many good nuggets in that one. I just appreciate the candor and the courage and the wisdom that you put into that book.
The best thing I did, Foster, is I got a co-writer. She
Great.
was a kind of an investigative reporter at the LA Times and has done a bunch of freelance. And, she was really helpful to kind of tell a complicated story.
Yeah, incredible. And even the title, what I learned, that's open, approachable, humble, just fantastic. Really, really well done. So let's start on the Stanford thing. You've been teaching there actually pre-pandemic.
Yep.
What changes have you noticed in any kind of incoming grad students to the program?
I told them the very first day I got there, I said, look, not because I'm so great, but I have a top 10 network. I just do.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm going to expose you guys to people that no other professor in Stanford will ever expose you to. But my expectation is you treat them all with respect, no matter where they come from. And they've lived up to that bargain extraordinarily well. I never realized that mental health was a thing until I started teaching 30-year-olds. And I'm much more attuned to how much more complicated this generation is with social media, all the pressures they feel that I know I never felt at all. And so I've become more appreciative of that. And I think, Foster, one of the things that has concerned me, but I actually last year saw a slight pivot, is that, I worry about them being unserious. I worry about them living their life like one startup at a time, that every relationship is transactional.
Yep.
And I have to say, in 2024, this is the first time I saw a pivot towards, hey, I want to look at things through a lens that is more permanent. I understand the difference between change and impact, things like that.
Any sense of what made that pivot?
Look, I think some of it's environmental. I think some of it is just what's going on in the world around them, economic volatility, higher interest rates, stuff like that. Not every startup is going to be successful, but I think a lot of it's just a reflection of the environment around them.
I've seen something similar. And in fact, the genesis of the book that I'm writing now is I was at a dinner party here. I live in Bozeman, Montana.
Right.
And I was at a dinner party, and I was hearing people of a certain generation like ours complain bitterly about these other multi-generations in the workforce. One was a very prominent orthopedic surgeon, and he was complaining about somebody he had hired who was a brilliant PA, brilliant. And but she wouldn't work the same hours, and she didn't go through the same rigor he did in medical school, and that she had the audacity to want to take Thursday afternoon off to go watch her kid's soccer game.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, what are we going to do with this other generation? I said, how about if we listen to them? How about if we learn a different way to tap what they're really good at? Because I've heard too many people throw away, Gen Z, this later generation, and they're the talents, what they've lived through in their lives, the change they've adapted to, the digital fluency.
Yeah.
There's something there.
Yeah.
So I've started to notice more and more of the people kind of coming around it a little bit, like, okay, bemoaning the fact that they are different doesn't help us anymore. What can we learn from these guys?
Yeah, no, I in some ways they're a reflection of the time they live in. Think about what we've shown them, the financial crisis, COVID,
Yep.
I would say geopolitical unrest, wars.
Yeah, so this covenant between the workforce, or the leaders of a workforce, and the incoming people, there seems to be a greater hue and cry for humanity, including what you mentioned before, mental health. We didn't have to think about that,
Right.
years ago, and yet we do. Part of my pro bono stuff is I work with D1 athletic coaches,
Mm-hmm.
and talk about tumultuous change, NIL, and conference realignment, and money into and transfer portal, but also mental health. So I'm a UCLA grad now. All of the UCLA athletes have to fly to Rutgers for a regular conference game, and we're not helping any kind of ability to deal with all that kind of stuff. In addition to the mental health stuff and the environmental issues that you're talking about, what other differences are you seeing, either through your work at New Enterprise Associates, and I'd love you to weigh in on this too. I know you do some mentoring of other leaders. I'd love to hear about that and kind of what's different today than you would have been saying to them 20 years ago.
People's backgrounds, their expectations, their awareness of the world, very different than, I joined G in 1982, very different, right? If Jack Welch had told me in 1982, go to Erie, Pennsylvania, stand on your head and do whatever I tell you, I would have probably said, okay,
Yeah, and enjoy it.
So that's, but that's that, right? So
yeah,
I think there's a very different contextual relationship between work and workforce now. I think what hasn't changed in Foster is, like, you only win by winning, guys. In other words, every year I'll bring in somebody like Jesse Cohn from Elliott, right? The most feared activist. And it shakes them up to, he comes in and says, hey, DEI is inversely related to interest rates. As interest rates have gone up, people don't give a shit about DEI anymore. Right? So now, but it's important that they see that, So I think one of the things that to mentor is bridging between here is the way to motivate people. It's different. But you only win by winning, guys. You only succeed by succeeding, and you need an edge and a bite and things like that to get that done. So that's a big transfer function. I think, Foster. So where I'm spending a lot of my time now is mentoring, not the CEO and founder, but the first line managers and companies. I've kind of started a training class because my experience was that there's a lot of CEO coaching, there's a lot of founder coaching, but the forgotten, untrained workforce are the manager of finance, the CRO, right, the CMO at that level, supply chain. So I've spent a lot of my time and effort these days kind of developing cohorts of senior leaders in small public companies and private companies where they just don't get any training, any training at all.
That's fantastic.
I think, if you stand back, having seen almost 100 CEOs in the classroom, I kind of go to four things. Like, one is just pure capability, intellect, hard work, competitiveness, things like that. The second one is, the best people I bring in have what I call a point of view, right?
Yeah.
It's the expression of judgment. Like how do they process decisions? How do they get input? The best ones just
Hmm.
they have a point of view, and
Yeah.
they know how to think through problems. The third one is always, inspiring a team. How do you build a team? How do you inspire a team? And then the last one is kind of how you process failure, right? Right.
Wow.
How do you process things that when they don't work, and what do you do about it, and how do you react? And so I think in some way, shape, or form, leadership is kind of that alchemy of capability, point of view, inspiration, and dealing with failure.
I've been a change agent for 45 years. I cannot imagine the degree and speed and complexity of the changes that you led your massive organization through. So nobody's got the accumulated wisdom you do. But you talk about the importance of values through that entire time. Could you spend a minute talking about, kind of how values can pull us through and why they're more important than just things on the wall?
Yeah, look, I think we live in such a complicated time, and such a volatile time, where you have forces that are, workforce related, customer related, economically related, government related, and all those things.
Yeah.
And when you're running a big organization, if you have to like go through each one of those prisms and think about what you believe in, uh, you're lost, right? There's not enough time. If you have to read the Financial Times
Yeah.
to figure out what you believe in, then you're doomed, right?
Too late.
So
Yeah.
I think it goes back, Foster, a little bit to what I talked about, having a point of view. Like I was super focused on having great products, no matter what cycle we were in, no
Right.
matter where we were, having great products. My father was a frontline GE employee, so I always saw the company through the
Mm.
eyes of the front lines.
Hmm.
I was a big time customer guy.
Hmm.
I was willing to make decisions in big rooms, knowing that you were going to get second guessed, but you could have lots of inputs, right, as you did that. So, those are things that were just part of my core,
Yeah.
and things that I kind of look for, because, to the conversation you and I are having, if you don't know what you stand for, the world is too hard right now.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a
Yeah.
better time to be a leader than right now.
I heard a great story from, I've worked as a consultant to Deloitte for 25 years.
Right.
And they tell a story in 2012, 2013. The managing partner for the US firm, in essence, the CEO, convened a working group. And it's really to look at the kind of guardrails around who they were as a firm,
Mhm.
and how they would process the events in a prescient way, the
Mhm.
events of the world, and what statement that the firm would weigh in on and which ones they would leave alone, like
Yeah.
reproductive rights. Like who knew in 2012 that Roe v. Wade would be overturned, and that this workforce of 150,000, mostly women, would be affected. Does the firm step in and make a statement about that? They chose yes because one of the most fascinating pieces, and I think it was kind of a quick hit in your book, but you talked about, I went to business school and I learned the Jack Welchian kind of stuff, number one and number two and all we do and all that
Mhm.
stuff. And you at one point, I don't say went away from that, but you changed it a little bit. You said with that customer lens on it.
Yeah.
No, we could be number three in an area where we're serving the customer well. Could you talk a bit about that? And was that a
Yeah.
difficult shift?
I loved working for Jack. Loved
Mm.
working for Jack. But even the day I became CEO, there were a lot of places I thought he was wrong. There just were
Sure.
a lot of places
Yeah.
I just thought he was wrong. And so I think when you follow somebody famous, the trick is to change. What I would say is that, change quietly, right?
Mm. Mm.
Drive change every day, but never kind of stand up and say, okay, this guy was really wrong.
Yeah.
about that, right?
Yeah.
And that was always, it's much easier, by the way, I think your listeners would know, it's much easier to follow a jerk. That's a much
Yes.
better, that's the
It's
better
so true.
choice
That is
by
so
far.
true. Easy
So I,
peasy.
I just
Yeah.
felt like he was nowhere from a technology standpoint. He was nowhere from a globalization standpoint. Um, and I felt that, and I wanted to change that. He was unbelievable financially. He was unbelievable. He was without like saying he was coaching, he was a great coach,
Okay. Yeah.
and so there were things. So I think the lesson for everybody is, you, leadership is kind of a one act play. It
Mm.
has to do with kind of point in time, what works,
Yeah.
what can you learn, what has to change, and things like that. And so, who was a great, I would say, like in the media space, which I know a little bit
Mm.
about.
Yeah.
I always thought Bob Iger was
Mm.
head and shoulders above everybody else, and I still have immense respect for Bob today. But
Yeah.
look, in the world of streaming and all
Oh
this other
boy.
stuff, it's kind of like life is brutal. And
Yeah.
my students now, they kind of know who Jack Welch is, but not really. Their heroes are Jeff Bezos or
Right.
Elon
Right. Right.
Musk. 20 years from now, they'll be a whole nother generation. So I think as you coach, you do a lot of coaching.
Yeah.
The goal you have is to tell people to be the best version of themselves. Be the
Yeah.
best version
Right.
of yourself. Be comfortable with yourself. Be willing to stand apart when you have to. Those
Yeah.
kinds of things.
And understand the context within which you're leading.
You're leading. Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Jeff, the other thing that came to me very loud and clear here, and I'd love to stay on this change notion for a second.
Yeah.
Earlier, you talked about kind of the 4 characteristics of what you look for in a leader. Does that differ when you think about leading dynamic change like you've had to lead? Is there a 4+? Is there something else that you look for that tells you this leader is going to be able to lead massive change?
Yeah, look, I think it's somewhere in the realm of having a point of view and inspiring a team, and so part of having a point of view is being willing to stand apart, and part of driving change is being willing to stand apart and really constantly trying to coach and nurture to drive people to change. I think in the book, Foster, I talk about, one of the changes that I led that worked is we became a fantastic global company, right? Over
Mm-hmm.
that time period. I was in
Yeah.
I was in Saudi Arabia last week, and you know, at a big healthcare show, I saw 100 GE people.
Wow.
They're in the Ministry of Finance. They're running companies. They're running entrepreneurs. These are all people
Wow.
that grew up in the GE system, that are
Yep.
local nationals. I mean, amazing, right?
That's
And
amazing.
then one that I tried to lead that failed was really trying to digitize the company to get ahead of the
Right.
big data wave, to be a big player in AI, things like that. You know, I mean, what was different? I had a great leader on globalization. I didn't have a great leader in digital, right?
Yeah.
I funded both over the top. I was a cheerleader. I did all those things. I fired people. I did the things you have to do. But sometimes I think maybe you pick off more than, I would say, if I look at it, I had the wrong team,
Mm.
and I bit off more than I could chew. Right? I wasn't able to leverage enough core competencies and things like that. So change is a great horizontal skill. It's one of those things where if you can do it in one industry, you can do it all the time. Some people are really good at it. Some people aren't. Yeah, no, it's important.
Everybody expects us to step up to the plate and hit the walk-off grand slam every time. And it doesn't happen. And there are a lot of logical reasons for it not happening. It wasn't, in your case, it wasn't due to lack of vision. It wasn't due to lack of effort. It wasn't due to lack of kind of the right thing. You're talking about one of the pieces that could be different next time, but in this case may not have had the right team or the right leader or the right timing or the right momentum. Lots of things can affect that.
I think this notion of processing failure.
Yes.
this is why most people quit. This is why most people quit before they reach their full potential, is that they just can't reconcile. They don't want to take the heat. They don't want to learn. They don't want to change. And I just think that's such a big part of getting anything done. I want my students to look. I mean, I had a tough dismount from GE, right?
Sure.
I had a tough dismount. I'm proud of the work we did. I think it stood the test of time. But there were big moments of time, like in 2018, I wanted to just like hide in a ditch somewhere, right?
Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
wanted to go on the run and hide in a ditch. And instead, I walked into the classroom at Stanford and taught business school students, right? I walked in 2018 when the whole horrible shit was being written about me, unfair stuff.
Sure.
And I'm a better person today. I'm a better person today, having been willing to kind of roll around instead of wallowing in pity, just like saying, "Hey, let's do it again." That's a big example, but I see it in people that I worked with that have had, some have dusted their pants off and gotten
Yep.
up and had great second careers, and some just can't recover. They just can't recover. And that's a big part of life, and it's a big part of having a business career.
So without playing psychologist on TV here,
Dr. Phil, here you go.
Dr. Phil. Oh, that's a bad analogy these days. But Jeff, that is a remarkable human trait. What allowed you to get up, dust your pants off, and get back in the game? What is that about you?
It's a great. So I say the first thing is like, I always tended to my relationships. And so I have a great family, I have a great wife, and I had great friends. To be honest with you, I just I had fantastic friends. I had banked a lot of goodwill, and a lot of that goodwill came back to me at the moment I needed it. Right. So,
Yeah.
some of that is just, I had banked goodwill. I didn't think about it that way. Right. But I
Yeah.
had.
Yeah.
Some of it is just like I'm stubborn, and I wasn't gonna have the last chapter of my life written by fucking Nelson Peltz, right?
Yeah. Right.
I
Sure.
just wasn't gonna let that happen. It was on me. And some of it's just the way I was brought up. I think I said in the book, and I think it's something that everybody thinks about, like, everybody talks about having thick skin. Nobody has thick skin. Really, nobody has.
Oh yeah.
You just choose the path.
Oh
you,
wow.
you choose the path you want to take. And the difference, the difference in business is that in politics, when you read stuff and there's anonymous quotes, these guys, they have no idea who wrote them.
Right.
Like when you work for people for 25, 30 years, Foster, I could pick out every voice. They may think
Sure.
you're anonymous. They may think you're anonymous, but they're not anonymous.
They're
right?
not
Because,
anonymous.
Look, there's nothing wrong with being humbled. There's nothing. I tell all the students, the power of reflection is hugely important, and I've had a chance to do both those things.
And I asked for me because I live in I get hired until I'm fired, and I get fired a lot. Like because of something's over. Hopefully, it's not something I did, but you kind of have to develop. You're right, though. Nobody really has that thick a skin. It's I worry about the youngest generation. I've got 3 grandkids and 3 step grandkids, and youngest is 5. And I watch the bulldozer parenting that eliminate any chance of failure from them, and worry about that generation that they will never have experienced failure. It's not part of, it was part of your upbringing. It's not part of yours. And I worry a bit about that.
That's what you want. You want people that have enough confidence that they can deal with failure in real time. And it's one of the things I like best about Silicon Valley is just, the best entrepreneurs are able to take a punch, pivot, keep going. They don't take it personally, and they're able to persevere. And I think
That's excellent.
that's such a critical part of, ultimately reaching your potential.
Yeah. No, that's well said. I was curious about the investment you made. I believe Crotonville was started by Jack.
Yeah. No, it
Yeah.
was actually started in
Oh,
1956,
oh, it was. No
but
kidding.
there's no doubt that Welch put his sweat equity
Yeah.
into Crotonville. And in many ways, I just kind of kept that momentum going. Yeah,
I'd say you probably more than kept it going. I
for
can't
sure.
imagine the amount of investment. I think I may be misremembering this, but you put over $1 billion into
Yeah, no,
the
this was
education
a
of
huge
leaders.
investment we made
Wow.
in education. I think it's kind of a look. I mean, I think, the Vita's got a great DNA, but, probably just in the time I was CEO, there's probably 70 public company CEOs that worked with us at that time period, times two CFOs, CHROs, people like
Yep.
that.
Yep.
So I think the investments that get made in leadership development and training actually do pay off. And I see that waning today.
Yep.
And that is, I view, not a good thing. I was talking to a friend of mine that runs an investment bank. 60 or 70% of their billing now is private equity, right? So private equity is just such a massive
Yep.
impact on everything. And, they don't, maybe they train individually, but it's not what they do really. So I view this as something that is I think a pretty big gap in where the world is today. Yeah.
I agree. We've morphed our consulting firm to probably half our revenues come through investor-backed healthcare or private equity firms,
Yeah.
and we
Yeah.
deal with the investors and we deal with the portcos and stuff. And I've got one private equity company right now that was being very magnanimous, and they said we're going to sponsor a high potential leadership development program. We want you guys to run it or to design it and run it, and we want to cherry pick people out of each of the portcos, and so show them that there is a systemness to us and that there's transportability between jobs, even though the
Yeah.
companies are slightly different in purpose. And just concluded magic. It just, as you know, when it works, it works.
Yeah.
And we said, but what about the leaders in your investment company, investment firm? They don't have the basics of what you're teaching these other people. Oh
Yeah.
yeah, that would be a good idea.
Exactly.
Like they just don't come from. That's not the fabric of their cultures and stuff. So
It's a hard, so I've been a venture partner at NEA for the last 6 or 7 years, and it's hard with the young investing partners. They're great kids, but they don't really know how to run a company. Many of
yeah,
them,
yeah,
don't know how to run a company, or they don't know how to give advice. And so
yeah.
that, I think, is similar in the private equity side as well. So that's a big gap.
Big gap. Out of all of the time you spent at Crotonville and the huge investment you made in developing leaders, can you think about kind of what you learned? Was there an insight or two that came to you as the
Oh yeah.
sponsor watching all this stuff happen? Could you riff on that for a minute?
Yeah, look, I mean, we talked about change earlier.
Yeah.
I think you go in and you have a class of 80 frontline managers, and you say, and let's say the theme is digitization or something like that. And you start the class and give them a little, kind of preamble, blah, blah, blah. And then you turn around and say, and start cold calling. Okay,
Mm.
Darren, what's going on in the aviation business, and what are you seeing from a big data
Mm.
standpoint? Okay, Karen, same question. And so I was really able to see what's not working.
Oh wow.
It's just like, because once you get going, and once they see that you're listening, and once you kind of get into making everybody participate, the rawness comes out. And I view
Oh, it's
those
great.
sessions to be like holding up a mirror, right? You walk in
Yep.
feeling you're Brad Pitt, and you look up and you're got like, you know, you're you got this gray hair and you're
Uh,
overweight and all this other stuff. And so I would always try to use a particular class to kind of give me a sense of like almost a stump speech, like, you're running for office, You got to go in and you got to state
Wow.
your case with 80 voters, and
Yeah.
you're getting a chance to hear from them in real time. What's not working? This really isn't working. And I became good over time
Wow.
and asking quite, going deep enough to get, okay, I get it now. That this is confusing. One of the things I did, Foster, which was I combined our CIO with the CDO because I wanted to get more money to invest in digital transformation. Mistake, right? And I got in one of these classes, and one of the kids in the class was a young CIO in one of the businesses. And he's saying, "Hey, Jeff, look, we're, all my projects that were almost complete, I had to zero base all of them. It's stupid to do these apps." He said, "I know you're trying to do the right thing, but it ain't working. It's
Wow.
not working." And, you're able to pick up a few things like that.
Two last questions. The first one I think you might have answered already, but I'd love to kind of repose it, which is you have an opportunity, you're whispering in the ear of a young CEO, new CEO, first time, and you're limited to one piece of advice. What's the one piece of advice you give him or her?
Do fewer things better.
Excellent.
Do fewer things better. Like everybody's does too much, so I think teaching them how to sequence their thoughts, get things done,
Mm.
and just focus more. It's just an easy trap to fall into.
Oh, no question. Oh, no
Yeah.
question. And then final question, Jeff. What's informing you these days? What are your sources of learning, and how do you stay kind of connected?
I still invest in energy, and so I bring in energy, like I would say, great domain, pretty good domain. I've got a set of analysts that I read pretty
Mm.
regularly. There's kind of a daily report that I read that's kind of written by a very economically driven, kind of analyst. And what I would say, if you think about the energy transition or whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of ways to make money. There's a lot of ways to lose money, and there's a ton of dumb money that goes into something like clean tech, right?
Sure.
So
Sure.
I always try to be very focused on domain. So I'd say I kind of, first I get up and I read, all the stuff that business people read, but unfortunately, just like I was 20 years old again, I filter all of it through the prism of nobody's telling the truth.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
sad. Like, so I'll read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and I put them in my own,
Yeah.
like little thought box, and come up with, okay, here's what I really think. I do contrarian stuff. I like to read. I like to read different points of view. Like I think I tend to be center right. I read the Atlantic every day. It
Mm.
is, pinko left wing, but I find it to be very well written
Mm.
and gives me alternative ways to think about the world. I read, ranging books on AI all the way to novels and spy books and things like that. I'm an avid reader. I'm a big sports podcast guy, so I
Oh,
do
cool.
I do a lot of sports stuff. And
Are you a New Heights follower?
yes, yeah,
Those guys are entertaining as hell.
very very entertaining. And yeah, no, so that's the world. And I think it sounds like you. I still work a fair amount, but only on the things I want to do. And
Excellent.
and that way, I think retirement is joyful, and that you can still keep your mind active, but you get to pick and choose the things you want to weigh in on.
Yeah, that's well said. Somebody was asking me the other day, and I said, I'm working about half time, but there's a peacefulness to the
Yeah,
work that wasn't apparent when I had to make payroll for so many years and do all
yeah,
that kind of stuff. And
yeah.
you get to pick and choose. And boy, there's some freedom in that.
There's some real freedom. I also tell people it's like sometimes I feel like it's being back in high school, only you have money, right? It's kind of like, you know, it's a great, the life doesn't suck at all.
I love that.
So,
That's awesome.
yeah,
Very cool. Well, Jeff, you've been so generous. This is fun. I
great.
really
So
enjoyed
much
juicy
fun. I hope we get to
conversations.
meet in person sometime.
I would love to do that.
Yeah,
But
me
thank you
too.
much. I appreciate
Great.
your time. My mantra, set the table, invite cool people, magic happens. Jeff Immelt is one of those cool people. Iconic, incredibly experienced and talented as a leader, and controversial to some. I found him open, approachable, humble, and smart. I had a blast in my conversation with Jeff. I left the conversation with his phrase ringing in my head, "You only win by winning." There's a difference between effort and impact. I am forever grateful to Jeff for his time with me and for sharing his journey on Stepwise.
Thank you for listening to Stepwise. Stepwise is brought to you by Dr. Foster Mobley. Edited and promoted by Zetis. You can listen to more episodes wherever you stream podcasts. Find out more at fostermobleymt.com or follow us on social media at Foster Mobley. That's FOSTERMOBLEY. We look forward to having an inspiring conversation with you soon.